thankfulness is a two-way street, right? Because it involves at least two people. It is good for the person who is giving, but it's also good for the person who is receiving. We have a saying in Portuguese to say that one cannot plant tomatoes and expect to harvest pumpkins.
Welcome back to Brain Chatter, where we listen past the daily noise and explore topics at the intersection of leadership, workplace culture, profit, and sustainability. I'm your host, Derek Brown. To see episode notes and to read more about any of the resources mentioned in this 44-minute episode, visit brainchatterpodcast.com. Today's episode is The Power of Thankfulness. Our guest is Dr. Isabel Scarinci, a psychologist and scientist by training who works in cancer prevention and treatment, and who also wears a number of other hats, including being a manager of people and processes. Isabel is a native of Brazil. She is a survivor of polio. She went to college in Brazil and then immigrated to the United States, where she finished the remainder of her formal education, including 3 additional degrees in her second language, English. She's also a former honorary consul general of Brazil to the United States. In summary, she's pretty extraordinary. I asked Isabel to be the guest discussing the power of thankfulness because she understands the tremendous science behind the impact of thankfulness. And I happen to know she's a person who operates with a great deal of gratitude, positivity, and goodwill toward all those around her in her own daily life. I know this because I've personally and consistently observed her do it. So beyond the science, she knows its practical implication and application. I'm looking forward to what I know will be an amazing learning opportunity from this conversation, and I'm thankful that you're taking the time to listen as well.
No, thanks, Derek, for such a kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here.
Let me start with the most basic question. Why is thankfulness important?
Well, gratitude is an essential component of human behavior, right? So particularly as it relates to social interactions with others. It is our way of recognizing and highlighting the good things around us. And it also helps us to bond with others in a very positive way and consequently improve our own well-being. Studies have shown that gratitude is linked to greater life satisfaction and optimism about the future because people who practice gratitude tend to have more positive thoughts, which has major implications for their health, including sleep. They sleep better.
This podcast episode was originally recorded in the year 2020. I am inserting an update edit right here in 2024 because Isabel's roles have changed and she's been elevated in her positions. She is now Vice Chair for Global and Rural Women's Health in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She is a professor there at the UAB Heersink School of Medicine next door. She's a founder of Operation Wipeout that seeks to prove for the first time that an entire U.S. state can wipe out one of the preventable types of cancer and do it by 2033. That being cervical cancer in Alabama. And she is a leader in another initiative to prove the same preventable cancer can be eradicated across an entire country, that being Guatemala. This led her to being appointed by the U.S. President and the White House to lead a work group charged with creating the United States nationwide cervical cancer elimination plan. You can read more about all of this fascinating and meaningful work online using links in the show notes of this podcast episode. I'll conclude the update here and return us to the original interview. First of all, why is a leader at a cancer center a psychologist?
So in cancer research, we have 3 major phases: discovery, development, and delivery. And if we are going to eliminate cancer as a public health problem, what is a vision for the O'Neill Comprehensive Cancer Center, we need all 3. So I have brilliant colleagues and friends who are much smarter than me, who work in discovery and development. I focus on how to get these discoveries, these technologies out to people. So, for example, my work is in cervical cancer prevention, a totally preventable cancer, where we have two major tools, screening and HPV vaccination. We already know that they work. So the discovery and the development have been done. So why haven't we eliminated this cancer? That's where I come in, to develop strategies to promote the uptake of these tools, particularly among underserved populations where the burden of disease is high. So that's why we have a psychologist surrounded by physicians and other scientists.
Probably everybody who is listening has been touched by the horror of cancer in some way at some point, maybe by watching a family member or friend fight for their life or dealing with it firsthand themselves. What does science say about the impact of someone's mindset when they're dealing with a physical disease?
Extremely powerful. Of course, sometimes the biology of cancer will set the course, regardless if the patient has a positive or negative attitude, like pancreatic cancer. It doesn't matter sometimes because it's so quick. But I am sure you have heard of stories of patients, family members, or friends that had similar cancers but have very different paths. Part of it is that optimistic patients tend to fare better because they face the challenges and roadblock with a very positive attitude. What I have noticed that's very important, they have a very strong desire to overcome the challenge. And they face that as a challenge that they are going to win. And there are many studies coming out in psychoneurology that are trying to elucidate these mechanisms. But we know that the positive attitude is critical. Another component that's also it's very important that we see with our patients is the support system. You know, the people who have a support system, who have the cheerleaders around them, also tend to do better in coping with the disease.
Have you personally observed cases where people who are capable of staying positive and thankful during a fight against a physical disease fare differently than those people who seem hopeless, outwardly blameful, and just fall into despair?
Yeah, quite a few. But my example that I want to share with you is much closer to home. It's my mom. She had metastatic breast cancer with terrible, terrible pain. And in the last couple of years of her life, it was a battle, but one that she was determined. I never seen somebody with such a determination to win that battle. Even when she was very, very sick, she would get dressed every day, and she had a purpose. And that purpose helped her to focus her mind on something else besides her suffering. So, in fact, she didn't look inward, as you mentioned in your question, at her suffering. She looked outward at all the things she still needs to get done for others. Even when the doctor was saying, we're done, there's no treatment. And she's like, no, I still have a lot of things I need to get done before I go. So the day before she died, she was teaching her nurse how to embroider. And the doctors were amazed how long she lived after they stopped all the treatments. And that is, we talk about mindset, we talk about social support, but those are the individuals who have a purpose. That optimism, they look forward, and usually purpose is something positive. So that helps them with their mindset and trying to cope better, with the disease than the ones who feel sorry for themselves or look more inward. Purpose is the key.
And it sounds like your mother was an extraordinary person, and what an amazing example she set in that very regard.
She was.
What about the impact of one person's thankfulness on another person? What have you observed about that situation?
So, thankfulness is a two-way street, right? Because it involves at least two people. It is good for the person who is giving, but it's also good for the person who is receiving. Being thankful brings pleasant emotions, which in turn is expressed back to the person who is giving. And appreciation here is demonstrated in different ways. It's not that thank you or the person who is giving knows that other person is appreciated. And then that person tends to repeat that behavior, and that goes on.
Well, let's switch over to the workplace. You are a manager of people as an associate director at the Cancer Center. So you're also on the practical front lines of management and leadership of other people. I've got two quotes I'd like to explore with you and have you respond to, if that's okay.
Sure.
The first quote is, quote, people who express gratitude, compassion, and pride of workmanship are viewed positively by those around them. An end of quote. What are your thoughts on this simple statement?
You mentioned three very important things. It's a very intense quote that can be conceptualized very different in psychology, but when they are together, they're very powerful. So let's start with the gratitude, and we talk a little bit about that, which is the recognition of great things around you and how these great things have enriched our lives. So gratitude also strengthens relationships because it encompasses social support. So that is, we understand that others are doing things for us without asking for anything in exchange. Which brings me to compassion, which is the ability to relate to others and put ourselves in their shoes, which also promotes strong bonds. Then pride is the sense of doing a good job. So that sends the message, I put my best effort on this task. Or in other words, I care. So when you have someone who does the best that he or she can, genuinely relates to others, and is grateful for what others do for him or her, who doesn't want to be around this person?
Absolutely. So then it would seem that the inverse of that quote would also be true, and that would be people who do not express gratitude, compassion, and pride are viewed negatively by those around them. Do you think that's true as well?
Yes, because one way of looking at the opposite of gratitude is entitlement. And I'm sure you never met an entitled person. But who wants to be around someone who always think they are better than everybody else, deserve more than others, and think very highly of themselves? These individuals are very disruptive because they do not take responsibility for their behaviors, and they cannot even notice the needs of others around them. So they sure are not compassionate, and there's no room for pride because, of course, they think they do a great job. So those are hard, and people do not want to be around them.
Okay, so now for the second quote. As a manager, why in the world would I ask someone to do something instead of tell them? Why would I say thank you after it's done? It's their job. Their thank you is their paycheck and not getting fired. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, since we are using quotes, let me use one from Maya Angelou. She said, I have learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never, ever forget how you made them feel.
Wow.
And that is a very profound, I think, quote, because everyone wants to be appreciated. even the entitled ones. It is who we are as social individuals. But I think it's also about leadership. If we tell someone to do something, there's no ownership. So if it doesn't work, it's your fault because you simply told your staff to do it. But if you ask and engage them in the task, they will own it. And then they will be more likely, I believe, to strive to do a good job. So if you just think from the employer perspective, it promotes what you referred earlier to being proud of their work, which in turn promotes self-efficacy or confidence. Confidence leads to improvement, which leads to efficiency. Efficiency translates into higher productivity, and an employee will go an extra step for you. Now, from the employee perspective, he or she feels appreciated, which will improve his or her well-being and confidence, which makes him or her repeat that behavior with her employees and get their appreciation for being recognized. And we can come full circle, and everyone benefits from a positive working environment. Not only that, they'll go home and repeat those good experiences with their families and friends. It's a win-win to me, but in psychology, we call that shaping behaviors. And we do that through modeling as leaders, right? Until it becomes an automatic response among the ones we are trying to influence. I try to engage my staff, and I hope I do it well, because that's why I think telling people it doesn't work.
You said something just now. You referenced that people are likely to take behaviors and feelings from work to home. And I think sometimes organizational leaders forget that. They forget that if they have a supervisor who's treating the people who report to that supervisor bad, that people take those bad feelings home. It impacts their whole life. And the inverse is true as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, because we are social well-beings, right? So if I had a bad day at work, I am going to take that home. I may not talk to my spouse about it, but I will be upset. I'm not going to sleep that night. I'm not going to eat well. And then I need to show up tomorrow. I didn't sleep all night. My productivity will go down. And that will carry on until we get that resolve. So definitely there is an integration about who we are at work and who we are personally. And us as leaders, I think we need to strive for having happy employees because the work environment will be much healthier.
By the way, that first quote that I read and you addressed was a Harvard Business Review article quote, and I will link to that article in the notes at Brain Chatter Podcast, as well as put up the Maya Angelou quote that you referenced. The second quote is actually a conflation of a number of statements I've heard personally from frontline supervisors or managers or executives in companies where our firm has just begun working with them on some sort of corporate culture issue. The second quote is not untrue. It is factual. It is somebody's job to get their job done. And a supervisor or manager can tell someone to do a task and not ask them. But I mean, it leads to a whole series of questions around what you just explained. Is that type of workplace likely to have a high or low turnover? Is it a workplace that's likely to have high or low trust? Is it a workplace that's likely to have good or bad communication? Is it a workplace that's likely to have higher rates of regulatory issues, union complaints, lawsuits, safety issues, et cetera? All those things are impacted by all those factors you went through. So my next question is, if expressing gratitude to others in the workplace is obviously a good idea, and if being thankful as a person in general is a good idea for our own mental and physical health, as you've described, why is thankfulness, both internal and expressed to others, not more common in the workplace?
Well, given your work, probably you know more the reasons than me, but I think there are many reasons. Perhaps this workplace does not promote gratitude as a value. And that is any workplace. The leaders are the ones who set the values and what is important. Perhaps when people express gratitude, the behavior is not reinforced. Nobody pays attention, in particularly the leadership. So I think it boils down to leadership. We have a saying in Portuguese to say that one cannot plant tomatoes and expect to harvest pumpkins. We need to start with the leadership. Is the leadership valuing that characteristic? And then I think it goes down from there.
And what a great illustrative quote. Thank you. Sometimes for most of us, if someone says, have a good day, we automatically say, you too, without even thinking about it or without even necessarily meaning it. We're on some sort of mental auto drive. Saying thank you can be said in a way that it's habitual and free of meaning as well, I think. Would you say something about how the brain processes this sort of auto drive thought, and is there any benefit to this?
Gratitude has an affective and a cognitive component. So the affective component is pretty clear, and we already talked a little bit about it. The cognitive component implies intention. So, for example, how parents shape the behavior of their children of being polite toward adults. When I came to the South, where yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, is part of being polite. And I have seen many times, if you observe, the kid says yes, and the parent immediately says, yes, ma'am. And they do even better if now the kid needs to repeat the behavior and turn to the other adult and say, yes, ma'am, or yes, sir. So over time, it becomes an automatic behavior. So those kids will learn that every time they are referred to an adult, they are going to say, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, and they don't think about it because they were trained to answer that way in this setting. And of course, then if they move up north, then they say, yes, ma'am. It's interpreted differently. I had a supervisor. This is a funny story because I learned English in the South. I came to Alabama 30 years ago. And it's the same as Portuguese. Yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am is part of who we are. And when I went to Mass General, where I did my internship, my supervisor said something, and I said, yes, ma'am. She said, you do not insult me. And I was shocked because I was like, what did I say? And it was such an automatic behavior, but she interpreted as me being sarcastic. So that is the setting here. So it became an automatic behavior that may be delivered with or without the affective component. So there's an intention there, but there's no the affective component. Over time, it loses meaning because it's what we do and we do not think about it. So that piece, the affective component, is a little bit harder to quote unquote train someone because it goes back to how you make the other person feel rather than what you say. So it involves many other cues that go with it, facial expression, other emotional indicators that make the person truly feel appreciated. I must share with you that when you send me the email for this podcast with the theme and the reason for the theme, it took me by surprise. And usually people ask me to talk about persistence, tenacity, and being a dog with a bone. But thankfulness was a first. And I read the email 3 times, reflect on it. That night at dinner table, I brought up to my husband and my niece. We have a 20-year-old niece living with us. And her response was, oh, yeah, that's you. And she said, you're even thankful for the pandemic. And I look at her because months earlier, she's a sophomore in college. She was complaining, about the pandemic and how that was taking away her college experience. And, she was the worst person on earth. And I stepped in and I said, look at all the other experiences you're having that you would not have had if it was not for the pandemic. Let's think about that. And we engage in that conversation. So she remembered. And that is the automatic behavior there. And I really appreciate you bringing such reflection, because perhaps became so automatic that I don't think about it. But that's how I was raised.
When I was trying to think of someone to have a thankfulness conversation with, you were right at the very top of the list. What does it take to be both authentically thankful and to authentically express thankfulness rather than just repeating some automatic phrases like we just discussed?
So one of the major gifts we have as humans is the ability to learn and acquire new skills, as we just talked about. However, for emotional cues and behaviors, it's critical that we are genuine. For instance, individuals with depression have a hard time seeing positive things. So one of the strategies that we use in therapy is for them to identify pleasant activities. And we even ask them to do diaries, and so they can bring to therapy, and together we can identify positive things and then start shifting and reframing with them so they can start rebuilding their positive emotions. And it's depending on where they are. That's very hard, because a lot of patients are going to say, no, there's nothing positive in my life. So we need to start somewhere. There are some studies that show that having patients to journal gratitude lead to positive mental health outcomes, which makes complete sense because they are forced to see the positive things around them once they need to write about what they are grateful for. The workplace, we can do the same thing through modeling, as I mentioned earlier about when we're talking about leaders. So some will not get the cues, like the entitled ones that I mentioned earlier. But over time, you can see the change. So as a supervisor, you can also create an environment where gratitude is valued and keep repeating that behavior in a very natural way, of course, not forced. Over time, I think it can be done.
I mentioned earlier that you are a survivor of polio. To many Americans and other Westerners, polio seems like something from ancient history, but it's not. Thankfully, effective vaccinations removed it as a threat from the U.S. and now almost the entire world. But as late as 1952, there were over 58,000 cases with over 3,000 deaths right here in the United States alone. And among those who survived, many ended up paralyzed. Would you mind talking about your experience with polio and what impacts it had on shaping your life and positive outlook of gratitude that is so obvious to those who encounter you?
I think polio, of course, has had a great impact in my life because it gave me the opportunities that I would not have if I didn't have polio. So, and I do not know any different because I had polio, I was 8 months old. So, as you said, in the US, I was in the 50s. Brazil, I had polio in 1963. So now everybody knows my age. I had the first dose of the vaccine. I grew up in a very, very small town. And I had the first dose. And when the second dose came to town, they would come out once a month. And I was sick. So the pediatrician told my mom, said, well, don't worry about it. We'll vaccinate her next month. And we had an epidemic. So I had polio in both arms and both legs. So the hospitals were closing. So my mom needed to take me to São Paulo, take the train, and leave me there because they were quarantining all the kids with polio. But I had a very, very strong mother. My mom would not give up on anything, as I already mentioned. And so I was raised in an environment where she took upon herself that she was going to end polio in the world. I don't know if she had that vision, but she definitely had the vision that she was going to do whatever she could. So we would go door to door, and she would dress me in shorts. And I recover, by the way, both arms and one leg. And I have problems with one leg and had multiple surgeries. And she would go with the cooler and say, you do not want this to happen to your child. And of course, she got 100% vaccination. So when I was about 11 or 12, she said, well, we'll get way more done if we split. She took, I think, the worst picture of me and went one way, and I went the other way with my brother. He would carry the cooler because I couldn't even carry the cooler. I was tiny. And I knew how to sell it, and I would get 100% vaccination. And sometimes when I tell that story, people say, gosh, how cruel of her to have this done to her child. But she did it in such a way that I felt part of a big thing. I was so proud of everything I was doing. I never felt sorry for myself or why me. When I was around 15, I had a moment one time. I had surgery and I was in bed, and all my friends for summer were out, because at that time you'd be in bed with the surgery for months. And I was like, why me? When you're 15, the world revolves around you. And there was a special on TV about the thalidomide, those kids that were born without arms and legs. And she just passed in front of the TV and said, at least some people have a leg to complain about. And that was the last time I complained, and I'll never forget. That helped me, but she raised me not to think about the polio, not to think about my limitations. And I see that a lot of times people even forget I'm slower. My husband is 6'4", and sometimes we're walking in the mall, and he's 3 steps ahead of me, even after over 20 years of marriage, because he forgets that I am a little slower. But then, she said, yeah, you have a disability. Just deal with it and focus on other abilities and other skills. And so that's how I was raised. So polio had a major influence because I think early on it gave me the opportunity to help others, but in a very, very sweet way.
Wow, I would say so. Thank you for sharing that. I know that's very personal. I was recently in the audience of a Zoom meeting where you spoke, and you were talking about both the near eradication of polio worldwide and now this project to prove that cervical cancer can be eradicated from an entire country. You made a statement, it was the impossible just takes a little longer. Would you say a little bit more about your perspective on that?
That is, again, that was not my sentence. That's my mom. My mom, every time we would say we can't do this, and she would all say the impossible takes a little longer. I challenge my students, my mentees, when let's say they're applying for residency or they're applying and they said, gosh, they only have 2 slots. And I was like, well, they need to fill those 2 slots. It can be you. Why not? Just do your part. So I think that's what comes in cervical cancer. That's a devastating disease. So we only have 2 cancers that can be totally prevented. It's cervical and colorectal cancer, because we can do the colonoscopy and detect the polyps early before it turns into cancer. And I see the analogy a lot with polio, because if you told my mom in 1963 that she was going to see the polio would be over in the world, she would laugh at you. But she kept doing her part. So cervical cancer is the same thing, as I mentioned earlier. We have the vaccine. We need to vaccinate our children to prevent this cancer and screening. So we just need to get the tools out there like we did with polio. So I think it can be done.
Wow. And I'll put some links in the episode notes to just that topic for anybody who wants to read more about that. One more personal question, if you don't mind. What are some of the things that you are most thankful for in your own life?
People. Different people have touched my life in many, many, many different ways. I'm very thankful for the lessons I learned, from each of them. Sometimes not good lessons, but I learn. Some we encounter the people who say, well, I learned here that I do not want to be like them. So that I am very thankful because I learned from those experiences. I am very thankful for my mother. It was the way she raised me, the way she raised a child with disability, not to feel sorry for herself. And I give most of the credit of who I am to her. She was not a psychologist. She was a math teacher. But that woman knew psychology and knew how to raise her children to be strong children, all four of us.
Wow. And what was her name?
Amelia.
Before we move on to the rest of this podcast episode, let me stop and do a more in-depth introduction of you. Isabel is the consul of Brazil for Alabama, a huge compliment from her native country. She holds an undergraduate degree from the State University of Londrina in Paraná, Brazil, a master's of public health from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, a master's in psychology, and a PhD from Louisiana State University. She did her pre-doctoral internship with Massachusetts General Hospital, Harvard Medical School in Boston. Isabel is fluent in Portuguese and English, and now U.S. Southern English, and is currently involved with the leadership of a Rotary Club effort to prove that a type of cancer, in this case cervical cancer, as she mentioned, can be entirely eradicated from a country for the first time in human history. She and her husband Richard live in Birmingham, Alabama. Did I miss anything you'd like to add, Isabel?
No, except that even after being in the South for 30 years, I still do not understand American football.
That's understandable.
I know soccer.
Well, it's becoming more popular in the South.
It is.
Isabel, now let me ask you just a few more questions. If someone in a workplace or otherwise wants to start practicing a life or a management or a leadership style that incorporates more authentic thankfulness, where would you advise them to start?
By example, being an example. I mean, you need to model that behavior to others, as I mentioned earlier, and value that behavior.
Absolutely. A big part of thankfulness seems to be setting aside time for reflection as well. You even made the reference to the gratitude journals as an example. How would you personally advise somebody to accomplish this sort of reflection time on gratitude?
Practice. As I was thinking about this last night, doing this today, I was raised Catholic. Every night we need to say our prayers and we need to identify things we're thankful for. My mom would not let us ask God about something without being thankful first. And I mentioned earlier how it helps with your sleep. So I do it at the end of the day. When I slow down, it's like, okay, I go through my day, think about the things I am thankful for. And I never thought I did because it was automatic. It was the way I was raised. So I think practicing is good. And because it's when we go to bed, you go to bed, the thoughts start racing. You start thinking about everything you have to do. Stop and think about how did my day go? What happened today that I should be very thankful for? And then I kind of go with my prayers. So that's how I do it. It works for me, but each person has a different way of doing it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing. Are there any books or other resources that have had a particularly profound impact on the way that you lead or the way that you see the world that you would recommend to others?
I am into experiences. I love a debate. I love to surround myself with people who think different than me. I love challenges. I put myself in those situations so I can challenge myself. Usually, what I tell students, my mentees, hang out with people who think different than you, because you're going to learn way more that way by seeing different perspectives. Sometimes, at work, they think I'm confrontational because I'll challenge, but I am challenging myself to think from a different perspective.
Is there any advice you can offer for someone who is about to lead a work team for the first time in their career? Perhaps something that you discovered along the way, but that you wish you had known at the very beginning of that point in your career?
Asking for help is the strength, not a weakness. That's what I tell my students, mentees, because sometimes I say it takes way longer for you to try to figure this out by yourself than asking a question and move on. And when we are young and starting our careers, we're not confident and we try to fake it and we don't ask for help. It is interesting, and I see this, with my own colleagues. As we get older, the full professors are the ones who ask for more for help than the junior faculty. So I think that's important. The other thing that I learned throughout my career is surround yourself with people who are strong in areas that you are weak and recognize them for it. Because you do not want to create a team that look like you, that think like you, that have the same strengths as you. So you need to have the humility of recognizing your own weaknesses and bring people to your team that can address those weaknesses. I think I have one more. The same way we want to move up, so do the members of our team. It is our job to bring them with us when we go up. And if we believe in what we do, everything will be all right.
We've covered a whole lot of ground in this podcast episode. Is there anything I did not ask you that you wish that I had asked you, or anything that you would like to add?
No, this actually has been a great reflection for me. It gave me the opportunity to slow down a little bit. And believe it or not, thinking about this today helped me to recharge. You had great questions. And for me today it looks like was a bit of role reversal. Usually I'm the one who asks questions, but you're the psychologist today. So it was a pleasure.
Well, thank you for your very valuable time, because I know you are stretched. You accomplish so much and you do so very much for so many different people. So thank you for sharing some of that time with me. Talking with you was a pleasure, as it always is, my friend. For the convenience of those listening, we are going to post links to the various articles, websites, and resources discussed in this episode. Those can all be found online at brainchatterpodcast.com. Brain Chatter is a production of Ken Chapman and Associates Incorporated. We assist clients across North America and beyond with leadership development, corporate culture transformation initiatives, behavior-based professional development for health and safety issues, individual and team assessments, conflict and performance management, succession planning, and team building, making a difference in organizations and individuals' lives for over 40 years. Learn more at leaderscode.com. Follow us on social media for regular leadership and management posts. Thank you for your time.